All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome. We've got a quick bonus rebooting the blue right now. Chris Humphreys here, and we're just going to chat about how can law enforcement folks even begin to think about finding a therapist. So, Chris, take it away.
How can they begin?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're, well, so yeah, if we just jump into the spot where, let's say that the first responders experiencing something or enough that they want to find a therapist. So we won't go into signs or symptoms, or I mean, just validating that, because there's a lot of thought that just one for supportive care a lot of times, right? Or the confidentiality. But yeah, we'll just jump in that they're looking for a therapist. They've decided they need to see one, or it's being recommended, and they're wanting to engage. And I guess that would be a bonus to, or one of the things I want to make sure that everybody should understand, especially in the world of being a first responder, right? Is, um, you know, the benefits of a higher level of care of an actual therapist, someone who's, registered, like in Oregon, registered with the Oregon Board of therapists and psychologists, or they're a clinical social worker registered there, right? They have that confidentiality piece that's written into the law, along with privilege, right? So there are some legal protections. So again, that's one of the things why we recommend a lot of times that be the route that somebody goes, especially if they're involved in something, a critical incident or something, and they need to talk about it, but they may be concerned, that there might be legal proceedings of some sort. By engaging with a therapist that's licensed or registered, you guarantee, again, the confidentiality and the privilege. And so, yeah, just jumping off, how do you find one? There's a lot of resources that we're sort of working on, again, in the state of Oregon, to sort of compile like this resource list of what we call culturally competent therapists. And that term is really interesting, but it really does just mean that a therapist that's got some training and experience working with a specific type of population, sometimes as a result that they come from that job field or population from prior, like again, my background as a former law enforcement and then now a therapist, you would say that sort of rates as some sort of cultural competency. Now, again, there's really no, there's not like an industry standard or a test that you can take necessarily. Although there are some organizations nationally that do give you a certification, and I can't remember what several of those are. Is like certified first responder therapist or something. It'd be like a CFPT or something. I mean, there's different. So they do have those because there are groups out there that do provide cultural competency training for therapists to work with first responders. In Oregon, I know that like Dr. Khan, I mentioned on some of these, Stephanie Khan, she does some pretty phenomenal trainings for therapists to help with cultural competency and working with first responders. So that's one of the first things I generally suggest to somebody is, I believe DPSST on their website, they have some resources with locating therapists, but really just either reach through your AP, or you can give a Google search a lot of times and just order therapists in your area. And then, when you're engaging with them, I always encourage people, this is a pretty important relationship, right, that you're going to have when you first call in to maybe schedule a time, or even just to see if this therapist is right for you. Ask those questions, right? Are they, do they have experience working with first responders? We say the same thing about veterans, and again, very specific populations. Do you have experience working with veterans? And they'll be completely honest. They're ethically required to do so. now having said that, I do think sometimes we get a little too caught up in the, oh, are they culturally competent to work with first responders? Again, I mean, sometimes, if it's trauma specific, trauma is sort of trauma. I mean, first responders don't just have a lock on it. Right. So that means, really, if you can't find somebody that says, I've worked with police before, but they're a good trauma therapist. I mean, don't shy away from that, right? I mean, they're probably still going to be okay, and especially if they're good therapists, they might. And I know I do this. I've done this when I work with populations I'm not completely right, not a lot of exposure to. It becomes an education process for me, and we sort of engage in that. So, again, I just encourage that they initiate that conversation early on.
Awesome. Okay. I love that. So, as they're going through that process, they're asking those questions that are important. Are there types of therapists or modalities within the therapeutic process that they want to ask about or keep an eye out for that work well for folks in law enforcement?
Yeah, we have found some that seem to be really good. We call modalities, right, or techniques that a therapist is trained in that works really good for law enforcement. A really a real popular and effective one that gets a lot of airplay right now, excuse me, is EMDR. That's the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a somatic therapy, really at its root. Well, I'm going to say that, and then I'm sure in the comments people will tear me apart, but it really is. And those are the ones. Somatic really means, right, it's kind of about what the body experiences at that time. But again, it just means sort of coming at the issue from the bottom up. What's the physical sensation you're going through? And then, of course, it does generally go cognitive in its approach because you're looking for thinking distortions, really, or negative cognitions. So EMDR is really good. Brain spotting is another one. Again, that's brain spotting techniques are very effective with first responders. I found along with EMDR, and in fact, brain spotting is kind of a child of EMDR. To be honest, it comes out of that. It's really effective. Those two are really good because if your therapist is trained in certain techniques under both EMDR or brain spotting, they can actually do some amazing work. And we call it, in your client, your first responder doesn't really have to talk about their feelings. I know, right? That's right. That's usually the barrier. If we go back to, what if somebody decides they need a therapist, usually it's the portion prior to that. Oh, Humphreys, I don't, I'm dying inside and I'm having all these thoughts, but I don't want to talk about my feelings. And I think they're pretty shocked when I say, well, okay, you don't have to. In fact, with like EMDR and some of these others I mentioned, there's some techniques where I don't need you to say a thing about the incident that you're struggling over. In fact, I'll have you write it down on a piece of paper that only you see, right? And then have you fold it up and throw it on the ground. And then as long as I know you're recalling it and then getting that physical sensation, then we can work with that. That's they call that blind to therapist, or actually the name's changed. I think it's called a silent memory technique. Sounds a little gentler than blind to therapist, but again, those are really effective, and that gets over that barrier of, Chris, I don't want to sit and I don't want to relive this and have to talk about it. You don't. And in fact, therapeutically, we find that, or at least I find, that's usually what sometimes the first responders really struggle over is if they feel that they have to verbalize it, and then they struggle with the fact of trying to make you understand it. I don't need to understand anything really within that. So yeah, EMDR, brain spotting, some somatic experiencing, but I won't also shy away from some of the general talk therapies, like really good cognitive behavioral therapy is very effective. And then the last one is that we see really successful is motivational interviewing, right? Because again, a lot of times it's it's that first responders in that situation where I know I need to do this. I want this, but how do I get there? And again, motivational interviewing is about assessing for ambivalence and state of change. And then one I throw out there to other therapists is like, be trained in career counseling, because really, if you're working with first responders, a lot of times I tell people it's like it's trauma and it's career counseling.
Mhm.
I mean, that's what it sometimes comes down to. So, um, a couples therapy, and again, these are all questions you can ask. I definitely, and therapists are not threatened, or they shouldn't be. If they're asked these questions, are you trained in this, or do you know this, or, um, yeah, for couples therapy, I'm a big believer in that the Gottman technique is very successful for first responders. Gottman technique, and then emotional focused therapy on the couple side. Usually they'll kind of implement both, but I think that is generally, at least for the start, probably the most effective. Now, having said that, all the research shows over and over again that really the most effective, or what makes therapy most effective, is the relationship between the client and the therapist. I mean, so again, it's not necessarily the technique, it's a relationship. But again, if I have EMDR and I can let my cop who's sitting there, dying inside, but does not want to talk about the image that's keeping them up at night. And I have a technique that I can use that they don't have to talk about it, but we can process it. And of course, our relationship as their therapist and client are probably going to be pretty strong, because now, right, they trusted me. They didn't have to. I told them, you don't have to talk about it right now, but we can still help you get some relief, right? So yeah, that was long-winded again. I tend
No,
to be
it's super helpful. Yeah, I'm keeping notes. I'm going to summarize it for everybody at the end. So then, though, that leads me perfectly into the next question. Since you mentioned that what makes therapy most effective is that relationship between client and therapist. And so let's say, someone it's the first time they finally decided, yep, I'm going to go try to find a therapist. I'm going to give therapy a shot. They ask these questions, they find someone who does these things, but then when they meet with them, they're like, this person's not going to work for me for whatever reason or another. Do they just give up, and does that mean therapy doesn't work for them, or like, do they try and find another person, because what we're looking for is that connection?
right. Of course, I mean, yeah, of course, the answer is no. I mean, don't give up. I mean, it's that relationship again. It's very important, right? You're you're working on very important stuff, right? I mean, it's healing. It's as much as like going and finding the right surgeon to do heart surgery. You're talking about, if you're reaching out, you're experiencing something that is very important, and you want to get a handle on, however acute it may be. And so, if you don't like the first doctor you sit down, and I'm not comparing myself to a doctor, but right, if you don't like the first doctor you sit down, that doesn't mean you walk away and still don't get your heart work done, right? Find you somebody else. And that's what I really encourage people to is it's okay. It's okay, 1, 2, or even 3 sessions, or even more in, where, make sure you're communicating with your therapist, and advocating. They're your employee. You're you're hiring them to work for you. Of course, they're guiding you, and they're, sort of the expert in certain fields on certain things. But if it's not working, address that, and say, and they actually have, I keep needing to remember, I'm a house kitty now. I'm a therapist too. Right. We have an ethical duty, and I do this, not a lot. I tend to, because of the populations I work with, I think our fit is finds itself pretty quickly. But there have been some where I'm like, and usually it's me making the call, like, what you're experiencing here is sort of outside my lane, but I know somebody over here, right? And since I work adjunctively a lot, and that's another option that you can have. You can have your primary therapist, but they may not be trained in certain things. And so, like in the world I live in, I get called in a lot, and I'll work adjunctively. So they'll have their primary therapist you know, that they'll be doing, let's say, we'll just call it talk therapy or the more cognitive stuff.
Mhm.
But it's very clear there's some somatic stuff and processing that needs to go on. Um, they'll get sent to me and I'll work alongside. So there's all kinds of adjustments that can be made within that, up to and including saying, we're just not getting along. This is not working for me. And that therapist, again, generally has an ethical duty to help you find somebody else, or they can, right?
Mhm.
I shouldn't put it that they have to, but most of the ones in the field that I know of, they're, you know, it's an egoless job, right?
Mhm.
I mean, and it really is. Um, and they're going to help you through that. So yeah, don't stop the process to get the healing that you need just because, you know, right, the first person you go to may not be the right fit.
Mhm.
Um, they can find somebody. And now with telehealth options and televideo, and we're seeing, like, for example, EMDR, there's some studies that have just come out that show that actually EMDR via televideo is almost as effective as in person. And I've seen that. I've actually done some unbelievable work using EMDR via televideo. Yeah, all over the state. So yeah, there's a lot of options out there to get people the help they need.
That's fantastic. That's exciting to hear. And also I would think probably helps folks working in law enforcement because especially in rural regions, right? Like if you have limited options locally and you don't want to go see therapists that you're going to run into at the grocery store and the bank and everywhere else, or that's who everyone else sees as a therapist. It gives folks options to kind of get that support outside of their where they live, where they work, and potentially to find the right fit. So just want to help folks. So when you think about finding a therapist, working in law enforcement, it's just the general, I mean, search your local area. You can Google, there's lots of different ways. If you Google finding a therapist, other things will pop up. But what you want to look for is someone who's culturally competent in law enforcement, if possible, while keeping in mind the fact that first responders and law enforcement don't own trauma, and anyone that's trained as a trauma therapist could be a great option potentially for someone working in law enforcement as a first responder. Some of the modalities that they want to keep an eye out for that would be beneficial for someone to have would be EMDR, brain spotting, cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing. And then if they're thinking about getting couples counseling support, they want to keep an eye out for folks that use the Gottman technique or emotionally focused therapy. And then within all of that, just keeping in mind what makes therapy most effective is that relationship between the client and the therapist. And if you try and the first one that you meet doesn't fit, don't give up. That doesn't mean therapy isn't for you. It just means that that isn't the person that's going to provide that relationship for you for whatever reason or another. So keep searching. Luckily, in our Law Enforcement Mental Health and Wellness Act work, our LEMWA work, all of our folks can try to access you and Steve for free to them. And if for some reason they're not able to access you guys know folks. So you can make recommendations for someone that they can use potentially through their health insurance or maybe even through EAP if you're just trying to identify someone that can provide therapeutic support. So there's lots of resources out there for folks. We encourage you to think about accessing that. Doing therapy doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It just means you're human. Everyone can benefit from therapy, especially folks in law enforcement, because you guys experience far more critical incidents than the average civilian does in their life. So anything else you
Yeah,
want to add, Chris?
Oregon's great because in this, I mean, there's starting to become a pretty good group of us working in this field.
Mhm.
And, you know, we sort of maintain a list of each other. I mean, it really is, I think, like OSSA and OACP, the Oregon Association of Chiefs of Police and Oregon State Sheriff's Association. I think they've kind of been given those lists too. So, and the other thing I would say is most agencies have a peer team or access to peers. I know I mentioned the AP, but what I was really also meaning was your peer teams. Technically, if they're a good, strong, healthy peer team, they should have access to higher level of care, which would be therapist level. If not, they should be able to find somebody. And again, if they're a true peer team, you'll have that confidentiality under them. So nobody will know necessarily that you're looking for a therapist, you know, right? So yeah, a lot of options there, but yeah. So
Awesome. And we do have a couple, we have a kind of robust interagency peer support team through Lemwa. And then we have at least one agency that carries their own peer support team, but engages with that Mid-Columbia. So we do have folks that are trained and certified to provide peer support in that area so they can provide that confidentiality and that protected status. That is understandably important to folks. So Chris, thank you so much for your time today. Hopefully this helps people find a therapist when they're ready to look. See you guys later.